Hello, Raggedy's friends. This is Rune, acting as your narrator for today's story. Let's see what we have here. Scary stories to tell in the dark? Oh, but there are too many of them! Ugh. I hate having to do this, but I might need to call upon some of Raggedy Anzy's friends for help. I hate collaborations. Anyways, please, sit back, relax, and enjoy this collaboration for scary stories to tell in the dark.
Some say this rhyme doesn't mean anything. Others are not so sure. There was a man who lived in Leeds. He filled his garden full of seeds, and when the seeds began to grow, it was like a garden filled with snow. But when the snow began to melt, it was like a ship without a belt. And when the ship began to sail, it was like a bird without a tail. And when the bird began to fly, it was like an eagle in the sky. And when the sky began to roar, it was like a lion at my door. And when the door began to crack, it was like a penknife in my back. And when my back began to bleed, I was dead. Indeed!
One night, a young girl was sleeping in her bed when a spider crawled across her face. It stopped for a few minutes on her left cheek, then it went on its way. When she woke up the next morning and looked in the mirror, she noticed a red spot on her cheek.
"What's this?"
she asked her mother. "It looks like a spider bite," her mother replied. "It will go away. Just don't scratch it." Soon, the small red spot grew into a big red boil.
"Look at it now,"
the girl said.
"It's getting bigger."
"That sometimes happens," her mother said. "It's coming to a head." A few days later, the red spot was even larger.
"Look at it now,"
the girl said.
"It hurts so much and it makes me look so ugly."
"We'll have a doctor look at it," her mother said. "Maybe it's infected." But the doctor couldn't see the girl until the next day. That night, she decided to take a nice, relaxing bath. As she lay soaking in the warm water, the boil suddenly burst. Out poured a swarm of tiny spiders from the eggs their mother had laid on her cheek.
There was a man who loved to eat. Every day he went home at noon to eat lunch with his wife. The man was not a good husband. He was a mean, bad-tempered, overbearing bully, and his wife was afraid of him. She was a shy, timid woman who did everything he asked. If she didn't, he would often beat her. One day, on his way home for lunch, the man stopped at the butcher shop and bought a pound of liver. He gave it to his wife and told her to cook it for dinner that night. His wife had prepared pasta for lunch, so he sat down to eat. While the man ate his lunch, his wife told him that a rich old woman in town had died, and her body had been brought to the church next door. The man was not interested in what she had to say. He was enjoying his plate of ravioli, which he washed down with a nice glass of wine. He didn't want to stop eating long enough to tell her to shut up. Finally, he said, Enough. I've got to get back to work." That evening, the wife began preparing the dinner. She seasoned the liver and cooked it slowly in a pot with vegetables and broth. After a while, she lifted the lid and the liver looked like it was done, so she cut off a small piece and popped it in her mouth. It was just delicious. The flavors were rich and vibrant. She thought it was the best meal she had ever made. She tasted another piece, and another, and another. It was so good, she couldn't stop herself, and before she knew it, the pot was empty. Then she thought of her husband, and she began to panic. He would be coming home soon. What would he do when he found that she had eaten all of the liver? He was not the type of man who would understand. He would be very angry, and she remembered the beatings he had given her before. She did not want to face that again. But where could she get another piece of liver that late in the day? It was then that she remembered the rich old woman who was lying alone in the church next door, lying in an open coffin, waiting to be buried. After finishing his meal, her husband got up from the table, patted his belly, and said, "That was just delicious." He had never had a better dinner. The salad with a drizzle of olive oil and just the right amount of garlic and vinegar, the fresh garlic bread, and the tastiest, most tender liver that almost melted in his mouth. He looked at his wife. "Aren't you going to have some?" he asked. "I'm not hungry," she replied. "You finish it." That night they went to bed. The man had fallen asleep, but his wife was lying in the darkness, unable to close her eyes. All she could think about was what she had done. Just then, she thought she heard a voice in the distance.
"My liver,"
it said.
"Who has my liver?"
It sounded like the voice of an old woman. Gradually it came closer.
"I want my liver,"
it said.
"Who has my liver?"
The wife listened. Was it just her imagination? Was she dreaming? The cry came again and again, piercing and terrible.
"Give me back my liver,"
it said.
"Give me back my liver."
"No, no, no," she whispered. "I don't have it. I don't have your liver." Now the voice was right next to her.
"Who has my liver?"
it asked.
"Who has my liver?"
The wife was trembling with fear. She pointed to her husband and said, "He does!" Suddenly the wife awoke in a cold sweat. She was so frightened, she could barely breathe. She couldn't stand the strain any longer. She shook her husband awake, and when he woke up, she confessed everything. She told him how she had eaten the liver that he bought. She told him how she had crept into the church next door. She told him how she had slit open the belly of the corpse, deftly cut out the liver, and brought it home to cook. Her description was so vivid, her husband could almost see it happening before his eyes. As he listened, he grew more and more angry. Then she told him about the ghostly voice she had heard, and he grew more and more fearful. The man was terrified of ghosts. "I'm the one who ate the liver," he said. "That means she will be coming for me to wreak her vengeance." He got out of bed, and without a word, he went downstairs. His wife sat in bed, wondering what he was going to do. A few minutes later, she heard his footsteps coming up the stairs again, and when he appeared in the doorway, she saw he was holding a knife in his hand. She screamed and screamed. Later that night, the husband crept into the church next door. He approached the open coffin and placed a fresh, new liver in the belly of the corpse. Then he went home and climbed into bed. His sleep was never disturbed again, and nobody ever saw his wife again.
a man named Joseph Blackwell came to Philadelphia on a business trip. He stayed with friends in the big house they owned outside the city. That night, they had a good time visiting, but when Blackwell went to bed, he tossed and turned and couldn't sleep. Sometime during the night, he heard a car turn into the driveway. He went to the window to see who was arriving at such a late hour. In the moonlight, he saw a long black hearse filled with people. The driver of the hearse looked up at him. When Blackwell saw his queer, hideous face, he shuddered. The driver called to him.
"There is room for one more."
Then, he waited for a minute or two and drove off. In the morning, Blackwell told his friends what had happened. "You were dreaming," they said. "I must have been," he said, "but it didn't seem like a dream." After breakfast, he went into Philadelphia. He spent the day high above the city in one of the new office buildings there. Late in the afternoon, he was waiting for an elevator to take him back down to the street. But when it arrived, it was very crowded. One of the passengers looked out and called to him.
"There is room for one more."
It was the driver of the hearse. "No thanks," said Blackwell. "I'll get the next one." The doors closed, and the elevator started down. There was shrieking and screaming, and then the sound of a crash. The elevator had fallen to the bottom of the shaft, and everyone aboard was killed.
A long time ago, there was a house that stood on the bay near Mobile, Alabama. It was known as the Madison Mansion, and it had been vacant and boarded up for years. Most people in the area kept well away from it, frightened by its uncanny reputation. Anyone who passed by couldn't help wondering what evil had transpired at the old place. Trespassers who dared to enter the old house usually fled during the night, telling tales so grisly that they were almost beyond belief. One night, 3 fishermen were caught in a quick-moving storm and managed to make their way back to shore. Drenched by the rain, they spotted the mansion and decided to take shelter in the rickety old house. Once inside, they made a fire in the fireplace to keep themselves warm and ate a cold supper. Then, the 3 men pulled their oilskin coats tightly around them and lay down on the floor to try to get some sleep. However, as soon as they dozed off, they were plagued by terrible nightmares of treachery and murder. Lying awake, the men heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. It sounded like more than one person marching back and forth. "Who's there?" called one of the fishermen. The footsteps suddenly stopped. They heard a woman scream. The scream turned into a groan and died away. The house was quiet again. Then, just as the man who had called out felt something splash on his forehead, something was dripping from the ceiling and forming a small, red puddle on the floor. To their horror, the fishermen realized it was blood. All of a sudden, a door upstairs crashed open, and the floor shook with the sound of heavy footsteps. It sounded like a woman being chased by a man. The frightened fishermen heard disembodied voices in the darkness. A man shouted in anger. A woman cried out in pain. They heard objects being flung here and there with a crash. Long howls of horrible laughter rose and filled the house. It went on and on until the fishermen thought they would go mad. Then there was silence. The fishermen huddled together and listened. After a few minutes, they heard something coming down the stairs. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy that bumped with each rotten step. The scraping and thumping noises came through the front hall and the front door opened. It sounded like something was being flung outside, landing with a thump among the weeds. Then the door slammed shut, and again, there was silence. There was a thunderstorm outside, and the house trembled as if it was about to collapse. Rain was pounding against the sagging walls. The terrified fisherman couldn't bear to stay in that place a moment longer, and decided to flee. Just as they reached the door, a flash of lightning filled every room in the house with a green blaze, and one of the men saw a ghastly face staring at them from the stairs. It was so horrible that it looked as if it came from hell itself. A crash of thunder deafened the terrified men as they ran out into the storm, never to return. Nobody ever knew for sure what terrible deeds had been done in that house. The mansion was built shortly after the American Revolution by an Englishman named Madison, who was a rich recluse. He lived there with his daughter, who was said to be mentally ill. Nobody ever saw her, and the servants were kept well away from her. They never had any visitors, and they never went out. One day, without a word of warning, Madison suddenly left for England and wrote to his servants, instructing them to sell the house. The daughter was never found. She just disappeared. After that, the house changed hands many times, but nobody could ever stay there for long.
It was almost midnight. Sally Truitt had just gotten on the subway train at 50th Street after visiting her mother. "Don't worry," Sally had told her. "The subway's safe. There's always a policeman on duty." But that night, she didn't see one. Except for her, the subway car was empty. At 42nd Street, 3 rough-looking men got on the train. 2 of them were holding up the third, who looked drunk. His head rolled from side to side, and his legs refused to work. When they got him seated between them, his head came to rest on one of his shoulders. Sally thought he was staring at her. She buried her head in a book and tried not to notice. At 28th Street, one of the men stood up. "Take it easy, Jim," he said to the man in the middle, and he got off. At 23rd Street, Jim's other friend stood up.
You'll be fine,
he said, and he got off. Now the only ones left in the car were Jim and Sally. Just then, the train went around a sharp curve, and Jim pitched onto the floor at Sally's feet. When she looked down at him, she saw a trickle of blood on the side of his head. And just above it, a bullet hole.
When Bill Nelson's cow stopped giving milk, he called the veterinarian. "There's nothing wrong with that cow," the vet said. "She's just stubborn. That or some witch got hold of her." Bill and the vet both laughed. "That old hag Addie Fitch. I guess she's the closest we've got to a witch around here," the vet said. "But witches have gone out of style, haven't they?" Bill had had a run-in with Addie Fitch the month before. He had hit her cat with his car and killed it. "I'm really sorry, Addie Fitch," he told her. "I'll get you a new cat, just as pretty, just as good." Her eyes filled with hate. "I raised that cat from a kitten," she hissed. "I loved her. You'll be sorry for this, Bill Nelson." Bill sent her a new cat, and heard nothing more. Then his cow stopped giving milk. Next his old truck broke down, and after that, his wife fell and broke her arm. "We're having a lot of bad luck," he thought. Then he thought, maybe it is Addie Fitch, getting even. And then thought, hey, you don't believe in witches, you're just upset. But Bill's grandpa believed in witches. He had once told Bill that there was only one sure way to stop a witch from causing trouble. You find a black walnut tree, he said, and you draw her picture on it. Then you mark an X where her heart is, and you drive a nail into the X. Every day, you drive it in a little deeper. If she's causing the trouble, he said, she'll feel pain. When she can't stand it anymore, she'll come to you, or send somebody, and try to borrow something. If you give her what she wants, that breaks the power of the nail, and she'll go on tormenting you. But if you don't, she'll have to stop, or the pain will kill her. That's what his nice, gentle old grandpa believed. It's pure craziness, Bill thought. Of course, his grandpa didn't have much schooling. Bill had been to college. He knew better. Then, Bill's dog Joe, a perfectly healthy dog, dropped dead just like that. It made Bill angry. Despite all his schooling, he thought, maybe it is Addie Fitch after all. He got a red crayon from his son's room, and a hammer and a nail, and went into the woods. He found a black walnut tree and drew a picture of Addie Fitch on it. He made an X where her heart was, like his grandpa had said to do. With the hammer, he drove the nail a little way into the X. Then he went home. I feel like a fool, he told his wife. You should, she said. The next day, a boy named Timmy Logan came by. Addie Fitch isn't feeling well, he said. She wonders if she could borrow some sugar from you. Bill Nelson stared at Timmy in amazement. He took a deep breath. Tell her I'm sorry, but I don't have any sugar right now, he said. When Timmy Logan left, Bill went back to the walnut tree and drove the nail in another inch. The next day, the boy came back. Addie Fitch is pretty sick, he said. She's wondering if you've got any sugar yet. Tell her I'm sorry, Bill Nelson said, but I still don't have any. Bill went out into the woods and drove the nail in another inch. The following day, the boy was back. Addie Fitch is getting sicker, he said. She really needs some sugar. Tell her I still don't have any, Bill answered. Bill's wife was angry. You've got to stop this, she said. If this mumbo-jumbo works, it's like murder. I'll stop when she does, he said. Toward dusk, he stood in the yard starting at the ridge where the old lady lived, wondering what was going on up there. Then, in the half-darkness, he saw Addie Fitch coming slowly down the hill toward him. With her pinched, bony face and her old black coat, she did look like a witch. As she got closer, Bill saw that she could barely walk. Maybe I'm really hurting her, he thought. He ran to get his hammer to pull the nail out. But before he could leave, Addie Fitch was in the yard, her face twisted with rage.
First, you killed my cat,
she said.
Then, you wouldn't give me a bit of sugar when I needed it.
She swore at him and fell dead at his feet. I'm not surprised that she dropped dead that way, the doctor said later. She was very old, maybe 90. It was her heart, of course. Some people thought that she was a witch, Bill said. I've heard that, the doctor said. Somebody I know thought Addie Fitch had witched him, Bill went on. He drew a picture of her on a tree, then drove a nail into it to make her stop. That's an old superstition, the doctor said. But people like us don't believe in that sort of thing, do we?
Donald and Sarah went to the movies. Then they went for a ride in Donald's car. They parked up on a hill at the edge of town. From there they could see the lights up and down the valley. Donald turned on the radio and found some music, but an announcer broke in with a news bulletin. A murderer had escaped from the state prison. He was armed with a knife and was headed south on foot. His left hand was missing. In its place, he wore a hook. "Let's roll up the windows and lock the doors," said Sarah. "That's a good idea," said Donald. "That prison isn't too far away," said Sarah. "Maybe we really should go home." "But it's only 10 o'clock, said Donald. "I don't care what time it is," she said. "I want to go home." "Look, Sarah," said Donald. "He's not going to climb all the way up here. Why would he do that? Even if he did, all the doors are locked. How would he get in?" "Donald, he could take that hook and break through a window and open a door," she said. "I'm scared. I want to go home." Donald was annoyed. "Girls always are afraid of something," he said. As he started the car, Sarah thought she heard someone, or something, scratching at her door. "Did you hear that?" she asked as they roared away. "It sounded like somebody was trying to get in." "Oh, sure," said Donald. Soon they got to her house. "Would you like to come in and have some cocoa?" she asked. "No," he said. "I've got to go home." He went around to the other side of the car to let her out. Hanging on the door handle was a hook.
John Nicholas raised horses. He had many horses of all kinds, but his favorite was Bess, a gentle old mare he had grown up with. He no longer rode her, for all she could do now was just amble along. Bess spent her days grazing peacefully in a meadow. That summer, for the fun of it, John Nicholas went into a fortune-teller's booth. The fortune-teller studied her cards. "I see danger ahead for you," she said. "Your favorite horse will cause you to die. I don't know when, but it will happen. It is in the cards." John Nicholas laughed. The idea that Bess would cause his death was nonsense. She was as dangerous as a bowl of soup. Yet from then on, whenever he saw her, he remembered the fortune-teller's warning. That fall, a farmer from the other end of the county asked if he could have Bess. He had been thinking that the old horse would be perfect for his children to ride. "That's a good idea," John said. "It would be fun for them, and it would give Bess something to do." Later, John told his wife about it. "Now Bess won't kill me," he said. They both laughed. A few months later, he saw the farmer that had taken her. "How's my Bess?" he asked.
"Oh, she was fine for a while,"
the farmer said.
"The children loved her. Then she got sick. I had to shoot her to put her out of her misery. It was a shame."
Despite himself, John breathed a sigh of relief. He had often wondered if in some crazy way, through some strange accident, Bess would kill him. Now, of course, she could not. "I'd like to see her," said John, "just to say goodbye. She was my favorite." The bones of the dead horse were in a far corner of the man's farm. John kneeled down and patted Bess's sun-bleached skull. Just then, a rattlesnake, which had made its home inside the skull, sank its fangs into John Nicholas's arm and killed him.
A farmer had a daughter for whom he cared more than anything on earth. She fell in love with a farmhand named Jim, but the farmer did not think Jim was good enough for his daughter. To keep them apart, he sent her to live with her uncle on the other side of the county. Soon after she left, Jim got sick, and he wasted away and died. Everyone said he died of a broken heart. The farmer felt so guilty about Jim's death, he could not tell his daughter what had happened. She continued to think about Jim and the life they might have had together. One night, many weeks later, there was a knock on her uncle's door. When the girl opened the door, Jim was standing there. Your father asked me to get you. He said, I came on his best horse. Is there anything wrong? She asked. I don't know, he said. She packed a few things and they left. She rode behind him, clinging to his waist. Soon he complained of a headache. It aches something terrible, he told her. She put her hand on his forehead. Why are you as cold as clay? I hope you are not ill. And she wrapped her handkerchief around his head. They traveled so swiftly that in a few hours they reached the farm. The girl quickly dismounted and knocked on the door. Her father was startled to see her. Didn't you send for me? She asked. No, I didn't, he said. She turned to Jim, but he was gone, and so was the horse. They went to the stable to look for them. The horse was there. It was covered with sweat and trembling with fear, but there was no sign of Jim. Terrified, her father told her the truth about Jim's death. Then quickly, he went to see Jim's parents. They decided to open his grave. The corpse was in its coffin, but around its head, they found the girl's handkerchief.
A young man and his wife were on a trip to visit his mother. Usually, they arrived in time for supper, but they had gotten a late start, and now it was getting dark. So they decided to look for a place to stay overnight and go on in the morning. Just off the road, they saw a small house in the woods. Maybe they rent rooms, the wife said. So they stopped to ask. An elderly man and woman came to the door. They didn't rent rooms, they said, but they would be glad to have them stay overnight as their guests. They had plenty of room, and they would enjoy the company. The old woman made coffee and brought out some cake, and the four of them talked for a while. Then the young couple were taken to their room. They again explained that they wanted to pay for this, but the old man said he would not accept any money. The young couple got up early in the morning before their host had awakened. On a table near the front door, they left an envelope with some money in it for the room. Then they went on to the next town. They stopped in a restaurant and had breakfast. When they told the owner where they had stayed, he was shocked.
That can't be,
he said.
That house burned to the ground, and the man and woman who lived there died in the fire.
The young couple could not believe it, so they went back to the house. Only now, there was no house. All they found was a burned out shell. They stood staring at the ruins, trying to understand what had happened. Then the woman screamed. In the rubble was a badly burned table, like the one they had seen by the front door. On the table was the envelope they had left that morning.
Lexi Morgan had a dream. She was walking up a dark staircase, and when she got to the top, she walked into a bedroom. The bedroom carpet was made up of large squares that looked like trapdoors. and each of the windows was fastened shut with big nails that stuck up out of the wood. In her dream, Lexi went to sleep in the bedroom, but during the night, a woman with a pale face, black eyes, and long black hair slipped silently into the room. She leaned over the bed and whispered, "This is an evil place. Run away while you still can." Then the black-haired woman grabbed her arm. Lexi Morgan woke up with a scream and lay awake for the rest of the night, shivering and shaking with fear. In the morning, she told her landlady that she decided not to go to Kingston at all.
"I can't tell you why,"
she said,
"but I just can't bring myself to go there." "Then why don't you go to Dorset?"
the landlady asked.
"It's a pretty town and it isn't too far."
So Lexi Morgan went to Dorset. Someone told her she could find a room in a house at the top of the hill. It was a pleasant-looking house, and the landlady there, a plump, motherly woman, was nice as could be.
"Let's look at the room,"
she said.
"I think you will like it."
They walked up a dark, carved staircase, like the one in Lexi's dream. In these old houses, the staircases are all the same, Lexi thought. But when the landlady opened the door to the bedroom, it was the room in her dream, with the same carpet that looked like trapdoors, and the same windows fastened with big nails. This is just a coincidence, Lexi told herself.
"How do you like it?"
the landlady asked. "I'm not sure," Lexi said.
"Well, take your time,"
the landlady said.
"I'll bring you up some tea while you think about it."
Lexi sat on the bed, staring at the trapdoors and the big nails. Soon, there was a knock on the door. "It's the landlady with tea," she thought. But it wasn't the landlady. It was the woman with the pale face and the black eyes and the long black hair. Lexi Morgan grabbed her things and fled.
I know it's around here somewhere. Some light will definitely help. Ah, much better.
Oh, damn it to hell.
Uh-oh. Something's gone bump in the night. Well, aren't you going to introduce yourself? Really? Well then, stranger. Goodbye.
Enough!